be talking about the basics of the federal E-rate program, which helps schools and libraries obtain affordable broadband. And this is one part in a series of webinar trainings that we're hosting to share important information about how schools and libraries can take advantage of and maximize E-rate funding. My name is Rachel Shemlin, and I am one of the E-rate and broadband education consultants in the Division of Libraries and Technology and with the Department of Public Instruction. And before we move on, I'd like to invite my colleague Bill to introduce himself.
Hi there, I'm Bill Herman. I'm also a consultant at DPI for E-rate and broadband, focused on library, but Rachel and I work together on school and library issues. And I'll just throw in too, I see that now there are more like 20 people in the discussion, so I think it'd be great to still ask questions using, by unmuting and asking. But if people will use that hand raising thing rather than just blurting out, that will probably help the conversation.
Thank you, Bill.
So I'm going to get started with these slides. The basics about E-rate. It's a discount program, and its purpose is to make it more affordable for schools and libraries to get internet service. And you can apply as an individual school or school district. That's actually not quite accurate. Schools don't apply individually unless they're private schools, but public school districts apply as a school district. And libraries can apply individually or as a consortium. And an example of a consortium is BadgerNet, which about a little more than half of the school districts in Wisconsin are part of BadgerNet. And there are two categories of funding. Originally, there was just Category 1, which was what the E-rate program started, I think, in 1997 or 96. And it only paid for internet access being delivered to a building. And around 2014, I think the FCC realized that you're not really getting internet to, you're not delivering internet all the way if you don't deliver it to people within the building. And so Category 2 was added to support funding for network expenses. And the amount of discount you get depends on the level of poverty in your school district and whether you're urban or rural. Basically, if you're rural, you get a little bit of a bump for a discount, and the higher level of poverty, that increases your discount. And they range from 20 to 90% of the cost of the eligible service. The program was created by an FCC order, and there have been subsequent orders over time to refine or add to what's eligible under E-rate. There's a group called USAC, and its function is to administer the E-rate program and also a couple of other federal programs. And the part of USAC that you're likeliest to encounter is PIA, which is called Program Integrity Assurance. They will check in after you've applied and ask questions to clarify that what you're asking for is eligible. We'll talk a little bit more about them later. And most of the people on the call probably already have an I think probably every school district in the state has an EPIC account. But you use that portal to both apply and to interact with PIA, and also coming soon to enter in your annual enrollment and free and reduced counts, which determine how much of discount you're going to get. And Rachel, do you want to say anything about the administrative window or the valid file?
Well, we're waiting right now for USAC to give guidance on that, and they have not opened the administrative window yet for districts to make those changes. It typically is open from early October through around January 5th, 6th, or 7th. And after that time, you have to make the changes before the window closes. So we will send out a communication to the E-rate listserv once we have the details of when that window opens, and also can post the valid file.
Thanks, Rachel. So this is a sort of an overview of what Category 1 and Category 2 are. In general, Category 1 is any costs that bring internet to your building, and those are going to be transport, which could include just an ordinary data circuit, but it could also include fiber that you purchase or lease, as well as internet access that's provided over that transport. In addition, connection fees and maintenance are covered by that. And Category 2, as I said before, is to support in-building networking expenses. And as you can see from this list, well, you can just read what's on the list. In general, it applies to any equipment that the internet traffic has to pass through to reach end users. So that's why these items are listed here. There are two other categories aside from network expenses that are part of category 2. One is basic maintenance, which is, if you hire a company to come in, this will not pay for, employed staff that you have, but if you hire a company to come in and, for example, make configurations to routers or take care of your networking equipment, not break fix on computers, but networking equipment, that's eligible. And then also MIBs, or managed internal broadband services, would be things like if you had a company that could manage your network remotely, their charges would be eligible. If you have a wireless access controller that's in the cloud, that's also eligible under MIBs. Rachel, do you want to add anything about those?
Sure. I have a link here to the eligible services list draft for fiscal year 22. The final eligible services list has not been released. Again, I looked back last year, it was the end of December when they released that list. So we will be sure to share that with you through the E-Rate listserv. These slides will be posted also to the E-Rate webpage under webinars, and then you can go to the links that way if you're interested in looking at the draft.
And also, you've mentioned, right, that there are no significant changes expected to the eligible services list for this year from last year.
Based on what we've heard at this point, but we never know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks. So this just shows what's called the discount matrix, and as you can see, it's based on two things. One is the percentage of your students that are eligible for free and reduced lunch. And that's based on, we're likely to be using 2020 information, which would have been from, which third Friday, Rachel, would that have been from?
Fall of 2020.
Fall of 2020.
Certified information from fall of 2020. We're always 1 year behind on that because of needing to use certified information and the process it takes.
Yeah. So your enrollment and your NSLP data will be based on, the free and reduced data will be based on that data from DPI. When we release the valid file, you'll be able to check and see what those numbers are. And if you think they're incorrect, or if you'd like to provide more updated or corrected information, send, I think, Rachel an email both saying what the correct enrollment and free and reduced numbers should be, but also proving that that's what they really are. And a common way of doing that would be a screenshot from your SIS. So you can't just write to us and say, no, we have a smaller enrollment. You have to send us documentation, and then we'll make corrections to the valid file. Also note that it may not be worth doing that if it's only going to be a question of a few students, because it's unlikely to change how much of a discount you're going to get, and that's the reason that we report these figures in the first place. So anyway, you can see from the discount matrix how it shakes out. You can see that rural discounts are a little higher than urban, and the category 2 at the highest levels are different from category 1. And then Rachel has also provided has also provided a link to the urban rural lookup tool, if you're not sure whether you're urban or rural. And Mike, do you have a question, or have you just turned on your camera? Sounds like it's just the camera.
Yeah, I gotta turn it off.
Okay. So did that cover it, Rachel? Yeah, I think it did. So a little bit of information on category 2, and this is one of the more confusing aspects of E-Rate. For category 1, there is no budget limitation. You're eligible to apply for no matter how big your expenses are. For example, if you purchase or lease fiber, and it can be a cost of $100,000 or even $1 million for larger school districts, all of that is eligible for funding. There's no limit on how much you can apply for. Category 2 is different. They capped it, and it's meaning that there is a maximum amount that you can get funding for, and that amount depends on how many students you have in your school district, or how many square feet your library has. We'll get to a little more about that in a minute. But the 5-year cycle, a new 5-year cycle started in July of 2020, and it extends out 5 years from that. So we're still early in the 5-year cycle, but after 5 years have finished, you lose the funding for that was available for those 5 years. So as we get closer to the end of the budget cycle, we'll be reminding school districts and libraries. We'll be identifying school districts and libraries that have a lot of unspent money to remind them to take advantage of this funding. So the budget per student is $167 or $450 per library square foot. And there's a funding minimum. So even if you only had 100 students, you get $25,000 budget, even though you don't have 149 students, which adds up to $25,000. And budgets are district-wide; they're not based on individual schools. And I had a comment to make about the funding minimum. Let me think for a sec. I think we'll get to it in a minute. So just as an example of a school district with 1,000 students, their budget is $167,000, which is 1,000 times 167 over a 5-year period. And that means that over this period, it can receive a E-rate funding for a total of $167,000. And that's the pre-discount amount, the amount that, for example, if you went to CDW GNS for quotation, if they said, okay, you've asked for $167,000 of equipment, you could get, that's the amount of money that you could get a discount for. And the budget amount, as it says, covers retail or pre-discount costs. And Rachel, do you have anything you want to add about that?
You covered it, Bill. I think that's the biggest thing people run into is they don't realize that they have to take this Category 2 budget and then plan accordingly for what they're going to get with the pre-discount, with their pre-discount percentage, and then they have to plan in their local budget to cover the difference. So working with their, as I say, working with their business office, working with their board policies, and making sure everything aligns in terms of these large purchases. Sometimes there are specific things they have to follow and timelines internally.
I guess, yeah, a way of explaining this is if you have a budget of $200,000, that doesn't mean you're eligible for $200,000 of funding from USAC for E-rate. It means that you can spend up to $200,000. And then if your discount rate is 50%, that means you would get $100,000 of funding. That's a source of confusion, I think, a lot of the time. So here's an example, and I'll show how to get into the budget tracker tool. It's very handy and works really well. I just used Stevens Point as an example. Their total C2 budget on the top, you can see, is just over $1 million, and that's based on how many students they have or had at the time, at the start of the budget. Whoops, I spoke wrongly. Their original Category 2 budget, I apologize, was 1.1, almost 1.2 million. The amount available is what's on top. That's the amount that's unspent in the budget. And the way they come up with that number is there's an amount that they've funded. So Stevens Point received a funding approval for $104,000 of purchases. And then they have applied for an additional $28,000 that hasn't been decided yet. So the total amount that they have available is their original minus how much they've already received and how much they've applied for. And let me, okay, sure, okay, let's do it this way. So I've just shown here a screenshot where you type in the entity name, then you can go to the next one. And then you just hit apply, and then you see what I'm about to show you. I'm gonna take control of the screen now.
Yeah, let me stop sharing here, Bill. Okay, you should be good to share.
Okay, yeah, sorry folks, just a sec. Okay, let me just, sorry here. So I'm gonna just show the budget tracker. And it's just what you saw in the, this is a huge overview of all the states, which is kind of cool to look at how much, like, California has gotten is eligible for the most funding. and this is how much they've actually received and how much they've applied for. So you can look at it at a state level, but much more likely you're just going to look at an individual level. And I'll show the same example over here. You just pick build entity name as the likeliest one, and I'll just do Stevens Point again. Okay, and choose that. Apply it. So this just shows Stevens Point School District alone, and it shows the same window that I showed you, the available amount and the whole amount, etc. And then this just shows it graphically. This is how much they've had approved, this is how much is pending, and this is how much is left. So it gives you maybe a more direct idea of how much funding they still have available. And I would encourage everybody to go in and just look at your Category 2 budget using this tool, and to keep track of it, because it lets you know, especially if you start running out of money, how much you have left. So Rachel, I think I'll give it back to you now.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So now that you've gone over and shown us more about the budget and we understand more about how that's determined, I think we should go through and talk a little bit more about the forms that applicants are required to complete. So this slide shows a visual representation of the forms, and in the next few slides I'll go more into detail about each form. But from this overview, we can start with the 470 form on the left side, and that's the form in which applicants describe the services that they're looking for. And it's also the form that lets vendors know that the applicant is interested in getting bids for those services. So first you post your 470, and then you receive bids and follow a process for bid evaluation using price as the primary factor. And it's important to note that you have to keep this 470 open. It has to be posted for a minimum of 28 days before you can select the vendor and then file the form 471. So you've posted your 470, you've had it open for at least 28 days. You're using that bid evaluation matrix and selecting a vendor. The next step is to file the form 471 to indicate that you've selected the vendor and you're requesting funding. And USAC will review that form 471, and then they will send you additional questions. That's your PIA. Bill mentioned that earlier, and they'll ask you questions, clarifications, documentation, and then they'll provide you with a funding commitment decision letter to confirm that you will receive E-rate funding that you've requested. After you receive that FCDL, that funding commitment decision letter, applicants file a form 486 to confirm that the receipt of the service or the service is started, and it's also verifying SEPA compliance. And then finally, the last two options here in green are for billing. Applicants have a choice of using the form 472, the bearer form, in which you apply to USAC for your percent of the discount for the reimbursement, or you can use the SPI method, form 474, and that's when the provider bills you at a discounted rate and the provider gets the reimbursement directly from USAC. And then although there's not a box for this form on the slide, there is a form called the form 498 that has bank routing information, and that's again a step where you'll need to involve your business office with filing the form 498. And so, go ahead, Bill.
Someone posted a question. When will the PowerPoint be posted on the E-rate website?
I can put it on after we're done. I usually do it beforehand, but I didn't have time this morning. So I'll get it up there as soon as we're done. Thank you. And let's see here. So in terms of the form 470 and all the forms that we're going to talk about, those are actually done in the EPIC portal. Bill mentioned that earlier, the EPC portal or the E-rate Productivity Center. And the form 470, again, you would do a 470 for your Category 1 and or your Category 2 services. It describes what you're asking for services. You can use an RFP, but that's optional. And you have to keep that posted for at least 28 days. We are going to have a separate session just on filing the form 470. That's coming up next Wednesday, I believe, or in November. I'll have to look at the dates, but we have a session coming up just about filing the form 470 because there are so many rules that have to be followed. with that process. In terms of deciding if you're going to post an RFP with your Form 470, it's something that districts often choose to do if they want to outline some requirements for a large-scale project like wiring, for example. And depending on the project or the complexity of the project, they might need to build in time in their process for vendor walkthroughs with engineers and making sure that the people that are going to bid, that the companies that are going to bid have enough time and information to prepare that bid. So again, 28 days is a minimum that it needs to be posted for. You'll also want to look and see what your ISP contract is to see when your contract dates end. You only need to file the Form 470 for Category 1 if you're going to start a new contract for internet service. If you're currently mid-cycle in a multi-year contract, then you don't file that Form 470 this year. The next time you would file that is when your multi-year contract will be ending and you need to get new bids for a service that would start on July 1. In terms of Category 2, again, you want to look at long-term planning and making sure you have enough time to have that bid posted for 28 days and that vendors have an opportunity to respond. You want to consider your board policies regarding bidding and contracts. And some districts require board approval for contracts over a certain dollar amount. So again, you want to make sure that you're looking at that timeline and backing things up enough to make sure that you can allow for that 28-day window, as well as selecting the vendor and having adequate time for board approval before signing a contract. And after you post the 470 and 470 for Category 1 or Category 2, vendors are going to request and respond, and you're going to start receiving those bids. And again, the bidding process is open for 28 days, and you evaluate them using a bid matrix, and price has to be the primary factor when selecting your vendor. In terms of evaluating bids, you want to make sure that the bidding process is fair and competitive, and that you've allowed sufficient time for everybody as a part of this process. On the slide, we say here that we strongly recommend filing the 470 no later than February 1st. I think that's, I actually would be a lot more conservative and try and get my 470s up in December. And I used to do that when I was in a school district because that way the 470 part of the 28-day window was over that winter break period. And that allowed more time in terms of evaluating bids and selecting vendors and filing that 471 earlier in our local budget process. So no later than February 1st, but you might start the process sooner than that.
Right, and I guess I would add, why not? If you know the kinds of things that you're going to get and what you're looking for, filing a Form 470 is really easy. So it's just putting out there, here's what I want, and inviting responses.
Thank you, Bill. I agree. Also, in terms of the Form 471, that's what you submit indicating that you followed that fair and competitive bidding process and that you've selected a vendor. And so with the Form 471, you have to provide more information about the request, the items that you've purchased, the quantities. You might be asked by PIA to answer questions and provide documentation. And you want to work together with PIA. The goal of PIA is to help get you your funding, but a lot of times they have to work through their checklist to verify eligibility. And so you need to respond to their questions directly. And then if you have any questions and you're not sure how to answer what PIA is asking, please reach out to Bill and I, because a wrong answer could result in denial of funding. And it's not always straightforward how they ask the questions. The other thing I would say is it's typical to see PIA questions. More applicants get questions than don't. And especially if it's a complex application, it would result in more questions. Bill, do you have anything to add?
I guess just to sort of echo, don't panic if you get a PIA inquiry, because I think, as Rachel said, the majority of applications do. And again, just to sort of echo what Rachel said, just see it as an opportunity to work with your reviewer to help them understand and not to feel like you're under attack by them, because they just need to clarify and make sure that what you're asking for is eligible.
Yeah, and then in terms of that funding commitment decision letter, go ahead. Bill, did you have something to add? I'm sorry.
I was just stretching.
Okay. You'll receive that funding commitment decision letter letting you know if funding is approved or denied. And those FCDLs come out in waves. So I think it's every Thursday there's a new wave of funding commitments. And it takes, a year for them to get through or more for them to commit to all of the funding that was requested. And so applicants, if you find out that your request was partially or fully denied, you have 60 days from the date of getting that funding commitment decision letter to appeal. And again, we can help you with that process if you're in that boat. The Form 486 is the form you file once you get that letter and you've been committed funding that states that you've started services. You usually have to file that within 120 days after the service starts or within 120 days of the funding commitment decision letter date, whichever is later. And you obviously have to file this before you can seek reimbursement from USAC. And the dates for E-rate are going to be different than the dates for the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So I want to make sure we're talking about E-rate here, and these are E-rate dates. In terms of receiving funds, you have two options for billing. Again, you can do the 472 where it's the bearer form. You pay in full to the vendor and then you file the 472 asking for reimbursement. The other option is the SPI method. Typically, if you're using SPI, you've worked that out with the vendor ahead of time, and that's listed on the invoice and on the PO so that they know that's the method they've agreed to, and that's when they bill you the discounted rate, and then the vendor goes directly to USAC for the difference. In terms of timeline, we've got this in red. Again, this is all estimated dates based on last year's timelines. USAC has not announced their E-rate training days yet. They've not announced the final eligible services list, and they have not announced like the EPIC window, the administrative window for free and updating your lunch and enrollment information. But basically, between now and early February is when we recommend you file that Form 470. Again, the drop dead date, it has to be up for 28 days. So that ends up being, the drop dead end date ends up being mid-February or early February. You want to make sure you're looking up your Category 2 budget and planning those purchases and aligning that to any district or library budget planning that you're doing for the fiscal 22-23 year. You also need to update your EPIC profile with that lunch enrollment information that's provided by DPI, and we will send out a message to the listserv. You generally need to update that if they open the window next week, again by early January. In past years, it was around January 7th that it had to be complete. And then the Form 471 window opens early January to mid-March. So that's kind of what we're anticipating.
And one more thing, Rachel, if you can go
Sure.
back to that.
Sure.
We'll get into some more detail about this in the Form 470 presentation, but just know now that if your school district is going to use BadgerNet next year, if you're using it now and plan on using it next year, you do not need to file a Form 470 for either internet transport or internet access, for example, for either of those two things. Simply, if you're on BadgerNet and going to stay on BadgerNet, don't file a Form 470 for either of those services.
Thank you, Bill. That's an important point. This is, again, just the timeline in a visual form, what we just talked about. And I'll have this slideshow posted. I'll go ahead and post this after we're done meeting this afternoon. And then for help and information, we have a link on the DPI E-rate page, where to get help. The USAC Client Services Bureau phone number, there's an online form, as well as we will post links to the USAC video training once they have their new videos. The ones that are up there from last year are still current, but we'll post any new videos, our own webinars. There's an E-rate listserv that you can subscribe to. We send out messages to that. And then again, making sure you're communicating with your PIA reviewer. and contacting DPI if you need help with that. We have some upcoming webinars. So Bill, that 470 one is on next Wednesday. So it is next week. The one that's in November is the Form 471. And again, you can go to the DPI page, broadband events, and you can add these to your calendar and then use the links to join. We'll also, last year, SCTDA did an E-rate training series, and we sent information out about that to the listserv. It was some really great training by state coordinators across the country, so we'll get that information out. And then the USAC webinar series is also available.
And Rachel, I see a question.
Yes.
Our fiscal year is the calendar year, January through December, which I think is unusual. Does that affect when filling out forms? No, the timeline for filling out forms is the same regardless of your fiscal year. You'll just have to make sure when you request funding that you'll have funding budgeted during your fiscal year to cover the costs of the stuff that you're requesting. Does that sound right, Rachel?
Yes,
John,
because the E-rate fiscal year is set. The E-rate fiscal year is July 1 to June 30th.
And John, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to just say them live. Okay. I
think the hardest thing, Bill, is trying to align and making sure you have in your local budget what you need to cover the difference of the percent of your request that's not funded. I also worked with business managers that were more conservative, and they budgeted for the entire amount for the project, not knowing for sure if the funding commitment was going to come through.
Which is a wise practice. And I know that one of the school districts I worked, in my budget, I listed the full expected cost of stuff, not the expected cost after a discount. And then if I got a discount, then the business manager was happy, and she just took the extra amount and used it elsewhere in the budget.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. But the important point, as Rachel said, is that you shouldn't budget under the assumption that you're going to get funded. You should budget, under the assumption that you won't, and then you'll have extra money if you do get funded.
All right. So with that, I can put a link to the DPI E-rate page here in the chat. That's where the webinar, the presentation and webinar will be posted. Do we have any questions? Otherwise, I can also turn off the recording and Bill and I can stay on a little bit in case there are questions. Bill, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and then we can just stay on in case someone has a question.
Okay.